Yeah, nice to see you. Cheers. Do I go first? All right.
Yes, you are, sir.
All right, shall I?
I will introduce you, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. We thank you for joining us today on such what we think will be a great day. It's a pleasure to welcome the Premier, Jason Kenney. We also have the Minister of Community and Social Services, Rajan Sawhney, and we have a guest speaker today who will speak to the attestment of this information that we're going to be getting shortly. So without further ado, I will turn it over to the Premier.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks to Tess Gordy, Executive Director at Wynn House, for welcoming us back. Minister Sawhney and I, Minister, are here. We're visiting one of their residences a few months ago, and we truly appreciate the work that Wynn House does with the support of its volunteers and sponsors to provide a safe home for the victims of domestic violence here in Edmonton. It's one of the largest homes for women who have faced abuse anywhere in Canada, and we truly appreciate the work that they do. Thank you so much to Minister Sawhney for joining me in today's historic announcement. Despite great effort over many decades by governments and nonprofit community groups like Wynn House, there is still a crisis of domestic violence against women in Alberta. Our province's domestic violence rate is the third highest in Canada. And in 2017, police reported over 10,000 victims of intimate partner violence in our province. That includes 16 deaths, tragically, according to Alberta's Family Violence Death Review Committee. Data compiled by Discovery House, a women's shelter in Calgary, shows that almost 30% of Canadian women will experience some form of domestic violence sometime in their lives. And of course, there are men who are also sometimes victims of such violence. The individual stories are heartrending. Many victims suffer in silence and suffer in fear. But brave survivors still step forward despite the risks to speak up, such as Calgary's Diane Denovan, and she's one such survivor. 3 years ago, she was beaten to within an inch of her life by a violent boyfriend. The attack came out of the blue. She had no idea that the boyfriend had a criminal record dating back to 1987, including criminal convictions for assault and domestic incidents. But today, with the help of her friend Krista Bochler, Diane is gathering signatures for a petition calling for legal changes that could have protected her and could help protect others in the future. I know that both Diane and Krista wished they could be here today, but they were overseas. Those changes that they've been fighting for are known as Clare's Law, named in honor of a woman in England who was murdered by a spouse who had a violent criminal history about which she did not know. Clare's Law was the inspiration for a law passed in the United Kingdom in 2014, a similar one passed in Saskatchewan last spring, and it was the inspiration of a law proposed by our party during last spring's Alberta election campaign, a law that would give people access to information about their intimate partners' police and criminal records. If Diane Denovan had been able to check out the criminal history of the man who nearly killed her, she could have avoided the violence that so terribly impacted her life. But she wasn't able to. This is a barrier in the law that should not exist. And that's why Minister Sawhney and I are so proud to announce that today we have tabled in Alberta's legislature Alberta's version of Clare's Law, the Domestic Violence Disclosure Act, that will help to protect victims of intimate violence from violent partners in the future. For the first time, it will create a right to ask in Alberta, a right to ask about police about the potential criminal record of an intimate partner. It will allow people at risk of domestic violence to submit applications for information on an intimate partner's history of domestic violence or related acts. Secondly, it will also enable the right to know. This will allow police to proactively disclose relevant information to those at risk of domestic violence without an application. So imagine there's a police call to a home because of a domestic dispute. The police discover that the alleged abuser has a criminal record for assault or for other violent crimes. Under certain conditions under this law, the police will then be able to take, in that case, the woman aside and to inform her that she is living with somebody with a violent criminal record, and then she can make a decision about how to stay safe. Important privacy and due process considerations, of course, must and will be taken into account in this legislation and the regulations that follow it. And I'll invite Minister Sawhney in a moment to address those important issues. But given the ongoing crisis of domestic violence in Alberta, the right to ask and the right to know are important preventative measures that will help to keep vulnerable Albertans safer. This platform promise, made and kept, is one of several related to protecting vulnerable members of our society, including victims of domestic abuse. In the months ahead, we'll be taking further action on platform commitments to combat sexual assault, to combat human trafficking, and to combat the sexual exploitation of children. So today's important announcement is another promise made and another promise kept. Thank you for your attention, and I'll hand the floor over to Minister Sawhney, and then at the end, and then other guests with us. Then I'll be happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Premier. Today, I will have the privilege of introducing Bill 17, the Disclosure to Protect Against Domestic Violence, Clare's Law Act in the Alberta Legislature. Last week was the International Day of the Girl, a day that recognizes girls have vast potential, promise, and every right to be heard, to be free and to be empowered to reach the pinnacles of that potential. And next month, we'll be talking about Family Violence Prevention Month, a month where we spread awareness about family violence, knowing that girls and women continue to be victims of domestic violence and victims of physical, emotional, sexual, and financial abuse. Mere weeks apart, and in the same breath, the celebration of girls is promoted across the globe, and yet this awareness campaign exists. And it is an acknowledgement that as a society, we fall far short of the mark. Domestic violence doesn't discriminate. It can affect people of any age, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation. However, we know that women and girls are the main victims of intimate partner and spousal violence. Females are victimized in 82% of police-reported cases involving opposite-sex partners. 82%. In fact, more than half of women who are murdered across Canada lose their lives at the hands of an intimate partner. Indigenous women are disproportionately represented in these numbers. And today, I stand in solidarity with my Indigenous sisters in spirit, acknowledging the ongoing tragedies of the missing and murdered Indigenous women. We need to do better. We can do better. And Bill 17 is an important step towards better. We believe that this law can save lives. We're looking at different versions of Clare's Law, both in Canada and internationally, and are using this knowledge to inform our own approach. We want to make sure that Alberta's version of Clare's Law is as effective as possible, and looking at its application elsewhere helps us to do so. I would like to thank the teams at Justice and Solicitor General, Indigenous Relations, and Culture, Multiculturalism, and Status of Women for their support in the development of this legislation. I would also like to thank the stakeholders who participated in the first phase of consultations. We received valuable input and diverse perspectives from the experts and stakeholders in the field of domestic violence, which will inform the bill's regulations. If it passes, we will continue with the second phase of stakeholder engagement to help inform the law's day-to-day applications. I look forward to continue working with our partners and stakeholders to develop the regulations that will empower those who may be at risk of domestic violence. Today, with great hope, determination, and intention to make a solid dent in reducing the rates of domestic violence in our province, I will introduce to you Alberta's version of Clare's Law. Thank you, everybody, for being here today.
Thank you, Minister Sawney. And it's now my pleasure to invite Ms. Andrea Silverstone to the podium. Ms. Silverstone is the Executive Director of SAGES, an organization that empowers individuals, organizations, and communities to break the cycle of domestic violence. She'll be sharing her thoughts on this legislation. Andrea?
Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm so excited to be able to be part of this process for this very important law. 2 years ago, I had an opportunity to go to the United Kingdom and meet with colleagues about innovative initiatives they are implementing to address domestic violence. One of the most impactful initiatives I learned about was Clare's Law. Because it had a much farther reach than the original drafters of the policy could have ever imagined. I believe that we will have the same experience here in Alberta. Clare's Law is intended to prevent domestic violence and provide safety to victims of domestic violence. But it will do more than just this. Clare's Law will also provide an opportunity for increased connections and sense of trust that victims and perpetrators will have with police. This trust will lead to more people getting resources and help. It will enhance the ability of the police, through connections with community agencies, to support victims and perpetrators to get the services they need to disrupt the cycles of violence before they begin or escalate. It will enhance the ability of the police. Clare's Law will allow Albertans to have another entry point to support victims. It will provide protection to allow them to make the informed choices about keeping themselves and their children safe. In some cases, it will stop the violence before it even begins. I'd like to thank the Government of Alberta for taking the issue of domestic violence so seriously. This is an issue that cannot be ignored. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. Just before I turn it over to Christine, the Premier's Press Secretary, just a reminder, this is an embargoed news conference. And with that, you've all signed embargo forms. But in terms of the legislation...
No live tweeting back there.
Just in terms of the questions that you may be posing, this is enabling legislation, so the legislation will enable us to then create the regulations, which we'll get into the specifics. That's why there was no technical briefing today, because the technicalities will be worked out in the next phase. So just to let you know and set the stage for your questions, the why questions are all fair.
Right, and maybe if I could just say, once again, thanks to Windhouse for hosting us. And the work they do is very important. I just wanted to reiterate for Windhouse that they'll see in next week's budget that we are maintaining the province's significant financial support for our women's shelters network across the province, as per our platform commitment. So I'm getting ahead of the Minister of Finance on that, but it's a commitment that the Minister Sawney worked very hard with the Finance Minister to maintain at a time of fiscal challenges. And I also wanted to say that as mentioned, the legislation is empowering, so the details will be worked out in regulation. We're able to work with a little bit with Saskatchewan that's already been doing that.
Yes,
so they've been spending months in preparing their regulatory framework, so it gives us a bit of a head start. So I look forward to taking your questions.
Go ahead, guys.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I believe that in places where Clare's Law has been implemented, the decision to how long it takes to disclose this information, whether to disclose the information lies within the police jurisdiction. So Clare's Law just gives them the, I guess, permission to do so. This obviously causes a little bit of a rift because some police jurisdictions may choose not to, or they would take longer to do so. So how would you address this criticism of the law?
That's a good question, and currently we're working very closely with police agencies to try to get their feedback. They are one of our key stakeholders, and we're still in the process of operationalizing the regulations and determining what those next steps are going to look like and determining what the police agencies, the type of role that they'll play. So that is still to be defined at this point.
Sorry, a follow-up question. Another criticism of the law is the fact that it may not be as effective because of the fact that when it puts the onus on the potential victim to leave a dangerous situation, and statistics show that a relationship, kind of like a violent relationship, becomes the most violent when you try to leave it. So how do you sort of address, how would Clare's Law help somebody in that scenario? And I guess, moreover, why choose Clare's Law in particular, as opposed to any other sort of legislation that you could implement to help curb violence against women?
Right. So there are several approaches that can be taken to reduce the risk of domestic violence, and certainly Clare's Law is just an additional tool that could potentially be used for potential victims of domestic violence to be able to find a way out of the situation. And I think what you've spoken to speaks to the need for wraparound support. So when somebody does take the option of using Clare's Law to find more information about a potential abusive relationship, it's very important to have wraparound supports to be able to define a safety plan and what the next steps will be.
And if I could just supplement that by to respond to the second part of your question, pointing out that we have a number of other platform commitments that we will be acting on that do provide stronger protection for prospective victims of domestic violence. For example, we'll be funding greater use of ankle bracelets to allow police to track the movements of, for example, perpetrators on warrants or who have other court orders against them. So those have been proven to be very successful. We're also doing it. We will also have defined a commitment to provide rape crisis kits to police stations and hospitals all across Alberta to establish a single call line, helpline for women who have been victims of sexual violence. And as I mentioned, will be maintaining the recent significant increase in funding for women's shelters like Wynn House across the province. So those are some of the measures, but in terms of other legal steps, I would just remind you that the Criminal Law Authority belongs at the federal parliament, and I would strongly support it if the federal parliament were to pass more stringent mandatory minimum penal sentences, custodial sentences for people convicted of serious domestic assault. Anything that carries a penal sentence of at least 2 years would be subject to the federal legal authorities. So, but that most of that lies within the power of Ottawa.
Let's come over to this
Kenny,
side.
I have a question to follow up on an unrelated topic. Greta Thunberg has arrived in Alberta. She will be having a rally at the legislature on Friday. I have heard from various of your ministers that there has been no communication between your government and her or her group. The question would be, there has been a lot said about you hope that she will learn about this. Would it not make sense to take the opportunity to meet with her while she is here to explain the government's role in petroleum production?
Well, first of all, we welcome Ms. Thunberg to Alberta. We'd just like we welcome any visitor, and I hope she'll find that Alberta is a beautiful place filled with friendly people. And to the extent that she's focused on questions around energy and the environment, I think if she takes an objective look, she'll see that we have the highest human rights, labor, and environmental standards of all of the world's major energy producers. And in the world, as long as there is a need for energy, I'd rather that Alberta was a major supplier than the OPEC dictatorships that treat women like property instead of people and that have little or no environmental standards. We have to do better on the environmental front, and we are doing better. And that's a case I would make to Ms. Thunberg or anybody studying Alberta's energy sector. We've reduced the carbon emissions from a barrel of Alberta oil by about 30% since the year 2000. We're on track to reduce it by another 20%. We're on the cusp of some major technological changes to reduce the environmental footprint of our energy production by moving from steam to solvents, from to natural gas cogeneration, for example, and carbon capture and storage, which is becoming scalable. Much of this will be accelerated with the introduction of our government's technology innovation and emissions reduction plan, including a levy on major industrial emitters that we estimate will reduce CO2 emissions from Alberta's economy by about 55,000 megatons. So we're making real practical. Our view is, in the real world, we're not going to shut down the modern industrial economy. The Asian countries are not going to turn off their efforts to provide energy to their growing populations. And so we can play a role globally, for example, by getting Alberta liquefied natural gas to Asia to help them to shift from coal, high-emitting coal, to low-emitting natural gas. So I hope that Ms. Thunberg and her friends will take a fair and objective look. We've not received any communication from her organization, and no request for a meeting, but we'd be happy to share that information with anybody who inquires.
Will you be reaching out to her or her party to tell her that directly rather than going through the filter?
Well, I don't know who that is. I don't know who. I don't have a phone number, and we have not had a request for a meeting. I can just share with you that everybody's welcome to come to Alberta, and we think that if they take a fair and balanced look, what they'll see is a place that's a much preferable supplier of energy to Saudi Arabia, Russia, or Venezuela.
Right. City TV.
Exactement sur cette question. Pourquoi ne pas profiter de cette occasion et avancer votre argument?
Tout d'abord, j'accueillis Madame Thunberg, c'est Thunberg, hein? J'accueillis Madame Thunberg en Alberta, comme tout le monde qui nous visite. J'espère qu'elle va trouver une province belle avec un peuple accueillant. Et j'espère que si Madame Thunberg étudie objectivement l'industrie énergétique en Alberta, qu'elle verra une industrie avec les meilleures normes environnementaux, de droits de la personne et de marché de main-d'œuvre dans le monde parmi les producteurs d'énergie. Alors, je crois qu'elle va voir le progrès énorme que nos producteurs de l'énergie ont fait, comme par exemple une réduction de 30% des émissions de gaz à effet de serre de pétrole albertain, et que nous sommes en train de développer les nouvelles technologies pour continuer à diminuer l'impact environnemental de notre industrie pétrolière. Alors, j'espère qu'elle est d'accord avec les Canadiens que c'est mieux que pour le monde, c'est mieux pour l'environnement, c'est mieux à l'égard de changement climatique, que le Canada est un fournisseur de l'énergie par rapport à l'Arabie saoudite, le Venezuela et la Russie. Alors, je crois qu'on a un très bon cas et je suis toujours ouvert de partager ces faits-là avec n'importe qui nous visite d'outre-mer.
Pourquoi ne pas prendre l'initiative, excusez-moi?
On n'a pas eu de contact de Mme Thunberg ou son équipe, mais je ne sais pas qui a organisé la visite là.
We're,
Tell us about how it will be determined whether or not an application is successful and who will be a part of that process.
Thank you. So we're back to subject here?
Can you just quickly repeat that question?
Yeah, actually, can I just to organize things, how about we just, all the Clear Laws questions we'll take now, and if there's other non-topics, we'll go there. Non-topics, I mean other topics, pardon me.
Sorry, can you just repeat that question?
What can you tell us about how it will be determined whether or not an application from a potential victim is successful and who will be a part of that process?
And again, that's part of what is going to be operationalized in the regulations. We will be looking at other jurisdictions like Saskatchewan to get a better understanding of what they're doing at the moment. But some of the ideas that have arisen are perhaps putting together a multi-stakeholder panel that would make the ultimate decision to disclose.
So you hear nothing in the law that describes the process?
Currently, it's enabling legislation. It provides a framework, but in terms of actually implementing the operational aspect, that'll be determined in the regulations.
And how will privacy laws be looked at in this? Is there a potential that this will fall under FOIP, that it's been requested, and potentially someone who's been accused could know this information? Is that being looked at in the process?
Absolutely, and that's a great question. We're being very sensitive to privacy considerations, and this piece of legislation will work in accordance with FOIP, and FOIP does allow for disclosure if an act allows for it. And we're working very closely with the Privacy Commissioner, as I mentioned.
And what will the timeline look on this after we introduce this enabling legislation? When can we potentially see the actual clearance law?
We are intending to implement by the spring of 2020.
Can I just add to that? Initially, we were planning on introducing the enabling legislation next spring, but when Diane Denovan's case came to light through recent media reports and her petition, we realized that I asked Minister Sani to accelerate the introduction of the legislation because this was a very concrete example of how it could have helped to potentially save somebody's life here. And so we want to thank Diane Denevin for having brought, and her friends, for having brought this to public attention. So we accelerated the introduction of the legislation. Minister Sani will continue to consult on the regs, which, and so all of that will be completed next spring, we hope.
Yes.
Would it be possible to hear Mr. Kenny in French
Sure.
briefly about...
On this issue.
Yeah, quelle est la situation en Alberta de la violence conjugale
Oui.
et l'objectif de cette...
Nous vivons une crise quant à, excuse me, I'm just going to, this is an issue I've never talked about in French before. Il y a une crise dans la violence domestique en Alberta. C'est la raison pour laquelle on a besoin des meilleures protections dans la loi. C'est la raison pour laquelle aujourd'hui nous avons déposé le projet de loi de Claire qui est basé sur un projet de loi en Angleterre et en Saskatchewan qui va donner aux gens, aux Albertains, le pouvoir à poser les demandes auprès des agences policiers si leur partenaire intime a un bilan criminel, violent. Également, ça va donner aux agences policières la capacité d'informer proactivement les victimes potentielles de violences domestiques d'un arrière-plan criminel ou violent d'un partenaire domestique. C'est pour donner le pouvoir aux femmes en particulier vulnérables s'ils ne savent pas que le partenaire a une trame violente pour qu'ils puissent décider à quitter la relation. Et dans la situation de Claire en Angleterre, elle a été tuée par un homme, un mari, son époux, qui a eu un bilan criminel depuis 20 ans, mais elle n'était pas au courant. Alors, c'est pour donner le pouvoir aux victimes potentielles. Le ministre va continuer à faire les consultations avec les policiers, avec les victimes de violences domestiques et les autres organismes. Et on va donner toutes sortes d'appuis sociaux, par exemple avec les subventions du gouvernement provincial pour les organismes qui protègent les victimes de violences domestiques.
We're going to go to the phones now. Operator, can you please put through the first caller?
And the first phone question is from Rick Bell with the Calgary Sun. Rick, your line is open.
This is going back to Greta's visit, if I could. This is for the Premier. What good do you think meeting Greta would do if you met with her, or frankly, if other people met with her, when by her own standards, which are very well publicized, including at the UN, Alberta's failed. In fact, everybody's failed. Nobody's done near enough. She's had it with fossil fuels, and that's her position. You could show her all the technology you want. You could show her the oil sands, the oil patch. You could talk about Saudi Arabia. She wants fossil fuels done. So what win could you or anybody else in Alberta possibly get other than a news story at the end of it saying, activist says Alberta a failure?
I don't know, Rick. We haven't been asked for a meeting from Ms. Thunberg. I don't know who's organizing her trip. We welcome her to Alberta. We hope that she gets a warm welcome, even from people who disagree with her. And we also hope that she's able to see that we have one of the most beautiful environments in the world. And I would just, I'd hold out hope that anybody would be willing to look at the objective data, which is that Alberta has the highest environmental, human rights, and labor standards of any major energy producer on Earth. Fundamentally, Rick, at the end of the day, if you believe that the entire modern industrial economy should be shut down tomorrow, that the airplanes should stop flying, that the cars should all stop driving, that millions of people should be put into unemployment because we need to turn off all the consumption of hydrocarbon energy tomorrow. If that's what you believe, then you're probably not going to be a supporter of what we're doing in Alberta. But in the real world that most people inhabit, where we understand the world is dependent on energy, the question is, how do we produce that energy in a more responsible environmental fashion? And how do we have a global impact? And, on Friday, for example, I'm going to be very happily at the opening of a new gas pipeline that will be bringing natural gas to a large electricity production plant west of Edmonton, which will allow them to shift from coal-fired power production to much lower emitting natural gas power production. Now, unless people want to throw away their iPhones and turn off and throw out their televisions and their refrigerators and stop using electricity, unless they want to live in the dark, we're going to continue to need electricity. My view, my message to Madam Thunberg or anyone else would be, if we're going to produce electricity, it's better that it's produced by gas than coal. Those are the kind of practical things we're doing in Alberta that speak to, I think, the legitimate environmental concerns that people want to balance with economic growth. But if you're somebody who's not at all concerned about the economy, then you probably won't find Alberta's perspective very persuasive.
Do you have a follow-up, Rick?
Yes, a quick one. What do you feel about the people who are sort of dealing with her arrival and events in Alberta with a certain breathlessness that they sort of are starry-eyed? There's a bit of starstruck celebrity attached to this whole thing, especially given the fact that if Greta's actual program was instituted in Alberta, it would be catastrophic. So how do you square that? But on the one hand, she's coming here and she's participating on Friday in a protest. That if her program actually was implemented, Alberta would be a catastrophe. And yet, people of various types are being quite breathless about her arrival here.
Well, like I say, we welcome anybody who comes here as a visitor. We're friendly people, and we have one of the most beautiful spots on earth, which is why folks from all around the world fly here to come and see it, actually. And we welcome everybody who visits Alberta, and I hope Ms. Thunberg gets a warm welcome. All I can say, Rick, is that Canadians understand that we need to balance legitimate environmental concerns with our desire for a good standard of living and a bright economic future for the next generation. And we believe we can do that, and we are doing that by reducing the environmental impact of our energy production. And at the end of the day, I remember when Jane Fonda came here a few years back, I've had to point out to her through social media that her mansion in Beverly Hills is right on top of the Los Angeles heavy oil reservoir with a higher carbon footprint than Alberta bitumen. So I think it's incumbent upon us to point out these facts to folks that in fact we beat the world when you measure objectively not just our environmental but also our human rights, labor, and social outcomes. And that's part of what we're doing here today. Here's a government that in a province where the energy sector has played a very important role, strengthening support, legal protection for vulnerable people. You don't see a law like this being introduced in Saudi Arabia, Iran, Venezuela, or Russia right now.
All right, we'll come back to the floor for one more, Nadine.
I have a question. I'm shifting gears a little bit. The NDP earlier today said that they were going to put forward an emergency debate motion to discuss the mandatory entry-level training safety measures. They were joined by members of the Humboldt victims' families. Do you accept the emergency debate?
Well, that's for the speaker to determine. We think that there's lots of opportunities to debate and discuss this. So let me be clear. We all want to do everything we can to keep our roads as safe as possible, which is why our government, as Minister McIver has repeatedly pointed out, will be introducing mandatory entry-level training for Class 1 drivers. There are some serious problems in implementing that because the NDP cut in half the number of driving examiners. And so suddenly they created a massive backlog in the number of applicants, taking months for them to get their certification. So school boards said to us they can't stop operating their school buses because of that backlog. Farmers said to us they still need to be able to get their grain to the elevators and to market, which is why an extension was granted in those sectors. I note that the previous NDP government exempted over 150,000 drivers, Class 1 drivers, from the new mandatory entry-level training requirements. So there was already that grandfathering which they decided upon. But let me also add that I've asked our Minister of Labour and Immigration, Minister Copping, to look into the connection between the temporary foreign worker program and the truck driving industry in Alberta. There was a very disturbing report in the Globe and Mail last week about what appeared to be widespread abuse of the rules on the temporary foreign worker program, bringing in people who are not trained to drive heavy trucks throughout Western Canada, and people who were put through totally unacceptable work schedules without proper support or training that are a hazard that can, in many cases, can be a hazard on the roads. So I've asked Minister Copping, following that report a week ago, to drill down into this and to determine if there's anything we can do to lobby the federal government to prevent foreign nationals from obtaining work permits to act as truck drivers in Alberta if they have not received that proper training before arriving in Canada. We also want to review those who are in the queue in the Alberta Immigrant Nominee Program for permanent residency to ensure that if they are working as truck drivers, they have obtained that proper training. And I know Minister McIver is also reviewing the regulation of trucking companies that have a poor record of complying with Alberta road regulations. So we will be implementing the mandatory entry-level training requirements. We need time to get it done because the NDP cut in half the number of examiners available. I wish that had not been the case, but that's the reality with which we are dealing.
With that, we're going to wrap it up. Actually, we got to...
Malheureusement, je ne suis pas au courant là-dessus. Permettez-moi de m'informer. Peut-être je vais poser les questions auprès du ministre Wilson. On a les très bonnes relations avec les communautés métisses. Ici en Alberta, ils sont les seules provinces avec un statut légal, avec une entente avec le gouvernement. On a les bonnes relations. À cet égard, on est toujours ouvert au pourparler avec la communauté métisse, mais je ne sais pas le cas particulier que vous avez soulevé. Thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate it.
Thank you.